Hello and welcome to Perspectives in Professional Psychology. I'm Dr. Lance Garrison, Dean for the College of Professional Psychology at the Chicago School. Join me as we explore the cutting-edge work of our faculty, alumni, and students across a diverse array of specialties within the fields of professional psychology. In this episode of Perspectives in Professional Psychology, we're joined by Dr. Grant Knipe. Dr. Knipe graduated with his Bachelor of Science in Psychology with honors from Appalachian State University. During his undergrad experience, he spent time in Appalachian State's Human Performance Lab, where he studied exercise and nutrition intervention models' effect on hippocampal plasticity. He joined the Cheatham Lab at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill to pursue his PhD in August of 2013. During his graduate school training, he investigated fetal alcohol exposure before moving on and selecting a new topic for his dissertation, investigating nutrition and lifestyle factors that affect cognitive function in typically aging older adults. I had a great conversation with Dr. Knipe on the powerful impact our gut microbiome has on our day-to-day functioning, including our mental health. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Well, hello, Dr. Knipe. It's nice to have you with us today. Welcome to Perspectives in Professional Psychology. I know we've got an exciting topic to discuss today, but why don't you get us started with just telling us a little bit about yourself and your role at the Chicago School?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. This is an exciting thing to do. So my background's in developmental cognitive neuroscience. I did my PhD at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and kind of had a joint appointment in the School of Public Health, Nutrition, attached to the med school there and the Gillings School of Public Health. But my, home department was psychology and neuroscience. My main advisor in my dissertation chair's background was developmental neuroscience, but she was stationed full-time at the Nutrition Research Institute, which is part of the North Carolina Research Campus. So I spent most of my time kind of traveling between the hospital there at UNC and then at the research campus in Kannapolis. And that just kind of created this weird background for me where I have this really strong public health, nutrition background. But I was surrounded mostly by like genetics professors and nutrition professors. And so when I was finishing up my PhD and doing fellowships, I got really interested in clinician training, which is how I ended up kind of like back on this side of, I think, clinical psychologists. And then the pandemic happened. And I met Dr. Collins Jones online and started working with the Chicago School as an adjunct while I was a visiting professor at Elon University in Elon, North Carolina. And just kind of got really intrigued by this idea of training graduate students and training clinicians. And then got really lucky when she invited me to join the faculty at the Chicago School at the new Dallas campus that she was kind of getting started at opening. So now I guess I'm going on 4 years that I've been in part of the Chicago School. I guess 3 years as a faculty member on the Dallas campus. And so as the non-clinician on our faculty, I'm handling all the research methods and stats stuff, which is I'm the stats nerd. Everybody knows it. So I teach research methods and stats, and then all of our like sciencey classes, biological bases, cog affect, those sorts of things.
Fantastic. So your line of research has been involved heavily in this thing that we call the gut microbiome and the gut-brain axis. Can you tell us, what is the gut microbiome? How does it interact with, how does our gut interact with what's going on up here?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was in nutrition, and then I call it the sexy new idea. I was in nutrition. We were all about individual nutrients and all of this. And then somewhere around 2016, I started chatting with, some of the genetics professors and our epigenetics ideas but what about how we digest our food? And this idea of the microbiome was still relatively new. It's exploded in the last couple of years. A lot of people were looking at our microbiome. We've got a lot of microbiomes. We've got our skin microbiome, genital microbiomes, but the one that's kind of become the big, the sexy poop study, as we called it, was the gut microbiome, right? And from my perspective as a neuroscientist, it was the gut-brain axis. And so we've been referring to the gut as our second brain for years, but nobody had quite defined what that meant. But we have about 1 million neurons in our gut alone, and they feed to the spinal cord and our peripheral nervous system. So it's controlling us in a lot of ways. But I guess briefly, it's this two-way communication system that we've really started to define between our gastrointestinal tract and the brain. And it involves all of the different parts of our nervous system and body systems, the nervous system, specifically the enteric nervous system, and then that microbiota gut-brain axis. And that's where we get into the microbiome and the microbiota pieces. We have 3 trillion bacteria in our body. Our bacteria actually outnumber us, and most of those bacteria are in our gut. So they're actually controlling what we do and what we think more than we might like them to in some instances, because they contribute to making many of our neurotransmitters. The fun fact I always like to throw out there is that 90% of the serotonin that our brain uses, actually more like 93, comes or is made by bacteria in our gut. So if we did not have those bacteria, we would not have the serotonin. Forget those SSRIs that everybody's talking about. Maybe focusing on getting more serotonin from our gut would be a good idea.
Yeah, that's so interesting. We often talk about systems and discrete systems like
Yeah.
our brain and our cardiovascular system, our respiratory system, and maybe less so, but our gut, our digestive system. But we don't often understand how all of those things are connected. And really, it's probably not using the right language to talk about them as discrete systems, right? They're all kind of one dynamic, reciprocally interacting set of organs and systems within our body that, and to your point, if something's going wrong with our gut, it's going to have an influence on how we think, how we feel, how we behave. So tell us a little bit about, beyond just the kind of connection between our gut microbiome and production of serotonin, the kind of the influence of nutrition on that system and how that impacts.
Yeah, so you've got a few of the different ways that I'll call them the mechanisms that are that bidirectional influence. I mean, it's the new neurotransmitters, GABA, serotonin, all of those, but it's also connected to all of these systems. So, I mean, we hear about inflammation being an issue, and it certainly is in an aging perspective. I mean, we just have this chronic increase in inflammation as we get older, and that's just by virtue of living, oxidative stress and all those types of things. But the gut shows inflammatory factors. We could look at a lot of different factors, IL-6, IL-1 beta, those that show inflammation, those originating in the gut too. But really what we mean by inflammation sometimes is a stress response. And I think that's something that everybody can kind of understand. Well, we know what it's like to be stressed. We get really tired when we've been too stressed. Think about this added inflammation or a dysbiosis, dysregulation of your gut is creating stress. It's creating more work for your body to do, and that's going to influence our brains. If not 90% of the blood that our body uses is used by the brain. So if we have a limited number of resources coming from the gut, or there's something not quite working right, then our brain's probably going to be one of the very first ones that's influenced. So we start to think about anxiety, depression, and just overall mood changing. You're not you when you're hungry is probably a lot more true than Snickers ever intended for it to be.
So that idea of stress, I've seen a fair amount of research that talks about the fact that chronic stress contributes to far more of our mental and physical health conditions than people often appreciate. How is it that chronic stress impacts our gut? What does it do to kind of shift the microbiome there?
That's something that I think we're still really learning as we've started to go. I mean, it's required a lot of computing power to do these like genome-wide association studies, the GWAS studies that we're doing with the microbes in our gut. But I think what we're seeing is a very clear indication that chronic stress, so even if it's measured by something as simple as cortisol, we can look at someone's elevated salivary cortisol across 2 to 3 days and notice a downregulation in microbiome diversity.
Mm.
that you've increased just by a little bit that inflammation, which means that the nutrients aren't quite there and the absorption goes down. And then it becomes a vicious cycle because you have a few too many minerals, you have a little less absorption of what you needed, which only feeds back into a poor system, which maybe changes mood, which means you don't eat the right thing again. And so it maintains chronic stress. And so we see just a 1 to 2 point like standard deviation change in our overall gut function or dysbiosis, leading to like 2, 3, 4-fold changes in overall gut microbiome composition and our overall cortisol levels that we see. And a lot of those are measured by inflammation because we kind of mean those as the same things across different systems.
Yeah. So the research is really clear about the impact of chronic stress on our immune system, right? It downregulates immune function. What you're saying is it goes beyond that. It's actually impacting the colonies of what we hope are healthy bacteria in our gut. So we're probably processing nutrients less efficiently. There are fewer of those bacteria producing that 90+% of the serotonin our body relies on. And so it kind of, and that contributes, that's more kind of stress feedback in that loop and creates a bad cycle.
Yeah. So one of the things that we measure, like even in a clinical setting, would be like vagal tone or the vagus nerve, which is really what's sending that major communication between the brain and really the rest of the body, but specifically between the brain and the gut. And it's transmitting signals from the gut and vice versa. And we know that changes in vagal tone, like very minor changes in vagal tone, or just heart rate variability, influence our mood, our behavior, and overall stress response. So if you have chronically high stress, then your stress response to new stressful situations might be blunted, and you experience even greater than it should have been. So then you get into conversations about resilience and things like that, which we could have a whole other hour-long conversation about, I think.
Yeah. So what's really interesting to me about the vagal nerve, if I recall correctly, is that relaxation techniques actually stimulate the vagal nerve, correct? Like abdominal breathing. So anything we can do along the relaxation front, whether that's, whatever people find relaxing, but deep breathing, meditation, regular exercise, things like that can have a big influence on the health of our gut.
Yeah, and now you gave me the perfect opportunity. I just want to plug like 3 of my dissertation students are doing that work exactly. So I've got one that just finished that's looking at college age students and graduate students on just like individual types of foods they're eating, change in the microbiome, but looking at depression and stress levels as outcomes to those. But pairing that with mindfulness. I've got 2 more students who are looking at just the impact of, it doesn't have to be like intense deep stretch yoga. We're talking about just 5 to 7 minutes of intentional mindfulness, paying attention to breath and things like that, not only showing the change in vagal tone or heart rate variability, but also showing behavioral changes in diet and what we actually measure as outcome measures, better nutrient absorption in blood samples, and things like that. So it's that whole system. It's a whole integrated system. There's a connection between how all of it works. And even just in surveys that my students are getting back, they're seeing that this change in just one behavior is causing different choices for foods. Just becoming more mindful about your body and more in tune with your body means that you start to pay more attention to those other things and can listen to all of the systems that are going on.
Interesting. I recall some research done several years ago where they looked at, they took a group of graduate students and put them into 2 different conditions. One was like a simple mental math condition, and then a more complex, slightly more stressful mental math condition. And then they had a variety of food options for them after that. And it was interesting that even under kind of relatively mild cognitive stress, it changed their selection of healthy versus unhealthy snacks afterward. So even a little bit of stress can have an impact on our behavior.
Right. And just being aware that it might change our behavior might help us make better choices, which is just really great. From a public health and educational standpoint, that's I'm always looking at my students. I'm like, hey, I know it's the end of the semester, but like that Monster Energy drink, like, could we try something else? Right?
Right.
Like, let's think about that. And I always get the walk back in my office. Oh, I can't believe you made me do that. But I actually ate blueberries this morning and I do feel better, and those types of things.
Yeah, I guess on that note, could you talk a little bit about the impact of diet on the gut
Oh,
microbiome? I
yeah.
know there's a fair amount of research out there that's measuring that impact, like healthy
Mhm.
whole food diets and their impact on
Right.
the gut microbiome versus getting more into that highly processed, refined foods, fast foods.
Yeah.
What do those two options do to the gut microbiome?
Yeah, I think if anybody's looking to just kind of do some research of their own that I think is very digestible, no pun intended, but maybe fully pun intended, right?
Right?
Um, is to look at the difference between the Western diet, which is a very American diet, very processed, high, and unsaturated fats and things like that, compared to things like the Mediterranean diet or more of these whole food diets. The joke that we used to always have in my lab in graduate school was if it has a nutrition label, you should probably take a second guess.
Sure.
Right. But that's really hard. And so when I would do our public talks at the public health department, it wouldn't be like, well, these individual foods. It's like, but let's think about our plate. Let's think about what's there. So we could get into conversations about fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, DHA, ALA, and those, but that you fall down into the rabbit hole really fast. We can also talk about choline, or lutein, but we fall down into those rabbit holes really fast.
Yeah.
But one thing that we know changes things and changes it for the better in a relatively short period of time is more whole foods. Not We could start to focus on antioxidants and things like that, but hey, some whole vegetables,
Yeah.
fiber. One of the major predictors in all three of my microbiome studies for better gut function, better microbiome diversity is just eating more fiber.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's because that's what the bugs eat in your gut. So looking at trying to get some whole foods into your diet might make a major, major difference. You don't have to completely change everything overnight. You just maybe try to get one or two, eat some broccoli. Do you like broccoli? Eat some broccoli. Hey, if you dipped it in ranch, that's still okay. We can work on that.
Right.
Maybe we'll try this next week. That's got some fiber in it too. But more focused on just looking at the foods you eat and being a little bit more mindful about them.
Yeah. So the idea of whole foods, and I think you pointed at this a little bit earlier, if it doesn't require an ingredient list, that's a whole food, right?
Right.
So anything from the
Mhm.
produce aisle,
Yeah.
anything,
Yeah.
most of the things in the meat aisle, probably fine. The key is
Yeah.
just trying to stay away from those highly processed foods.
Yeah. And I mean, we can talk about exactly which vegetables and whether they're organic or GMO and all these
Sure.
sorts of things. First thing I always say about that is everything's genetically modified
Right.
because whether it was intentional or not, we've modified them. Grains look nothing like they did 30 years ago. That's just a side effect of how we produce things. But a whole grain bread is still better than, a fully, white bread. And meats matter too. The grass-fed meats the meat is what it ate, just like we are what we eat. The meat is what it ate. So a grass-fed piece of beef is better. So we used to always tell, participants, it's like, well, having less meat, but having one good piece of grass-fed beef for the week and not eating meat the rest of the week is way better than eating meat every day.
Sure.
Or in the chicken you're eating, what was it eating? Because you're getting whatever it was eating. And just being a little bit more mindful of that. It might cost a little bit more, but we can save money elsewhere. Maybe we need less meat, but the meat we eat would be a better quality and things like that.
When our diet is comprised of kind of more of we'll just call it the wrong side of food choices, those highly processed, high fat
Yeah.
um, types of foods, does it actually change the composition of our gut microbiome? And I guess what I'm getting at is there like good bacteria, bad bacteria? And when we're
Yeah.
eating too many of the wrong things, is it kind of killing, for lack of a better word, the good and propagating more of the unhealthy gut bacteria?
I think that is a really great question, maybe one of the most important questions. And again, I'll caveat that we're still learning. We've learned a lot in the last, 6 or 7 years, and we're getting a lot closer to that. You look at individual genera, individual species of what they do, but what we do know is that there are indeed good bacteria and bad bacteria.
Right.
And some of that might vary by the person or what the intention is, and maybe even life stage. But we do know that there are some bad bacteria that like to eat other bacteria and are responsible for those inflammatory factors going up and things like that. One that everybody, but it's sometimes about the balance of the good ones to the bad ones, and not so much. It's what happens when the ones that tend to be in that 1 to 2% of our overall makeup start to dwindle is they're filled in by the bad ones. And so lactobacilli is one that might ring a bell with a lot of people. We all know what lactose is. It's not bad for us, but too much lactobacilli, because of an overabundance of like dairy fats in our diet, starts to overcome the good effects of some other bacteria, and they push them out of the neighborhood. And so some of those other bacteria that were doing a lot of good don't have room anymore, and these bad bacteria kind of start to take over. I used to always use the example, it's not as prominent in Texas, but we have kudzu everywhere in North Carolina. And it's like, well, it's a pretty leaf, but it all of a sudden starts to take over all of the property. You can't do anything about it. And so we have some of those that will easily take advantage of a situation if we aren't maintaining like a proper balance in
They
our
can
gut.
quickly become invasive.
Yes, invasive species. Yeah.
So a little bit earlier, you mentioned blueberries. Can you talk a little bit about what are they good for when it comes to the microbiome? And are there any other foods that are, I know we talked about whole foods, but maybe specific food choices that we can make?
So first, blueberries, I did a 3-year randomized controlled trial, true clinical trial, to look at the effect of blueberries on cognitive function in older adults. Really great read, worth reading, that paper. I took some of those out of that into the microbiome study with some of those people who were in that. But first, blueberries, anthocyanins in the blueberries, the stuff that makes blueberries blue, is an antioxidant. It's one of the strongest antioxidants that we have, in our environment. And oxidative stress is the major contributor to aging, cognitive dysfunction, inflammation, so on and so forth. But it has a greater effect than we might have expected once we start to put it in part of the diet. Blueberries are also pretty high in fiber, which we talked about as being good for our microbiome. But there was still this the antioxidants are doing something, but compared to our animal studies and our cell studies, they were doing even more than we expected. How are we reversing some of these cognitive aging effects? And so one of the questions was, is it changing our microbiome? Are we actually changing nutrient absorption of other nutrients because of these antioxidants? And I think there's some good evidence to say that might be the case. That we see an increase in some of the good bacteria in individuals that were on, the equivalent of about a cup of blueberries a day. We saw an increase for those. And again, these are just regression studies. This isn't cause and effect, but we see a trend. The more fruits, especially the ones high in anthocyanins, blueberries, blackberries, we saw some of these key species of bacteria really start to increase in those individuals. And then those went right in line with an increase in overall function. Their working memory and just overall reaction time started to increase in those individuals. And the exciting part was, not only did we slow it down in some, we actually reversed it, which I'm still a little afraid of. Because that just seems like, no. So somebody needs to give me another $6 million somewhere, and we can try it all again. But it is an exciting thing to see. And I do think that there's a significant role for the microbiome involved in that health effect that we get. And we just need to explore the mechanism a little bit more.
I guess my next kind of question is around the dose, right? So how many grams or whatever measurement of blueberries do we need to eat to start to see those effects? And is there a dose response effect to that? Can you just eat a ton of blueberries?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'll also throw in the example of eating fattier nuts, like walnuts are another really great example. Really high in fiber, really high in fatty and the good fatty acids that we need. And blueberries go right along with that. And So the study that I mentioned, the RCT that we did, I mean, that was the equivalent of 2 cups of blueberries a day.
Okay.
And so we know that's way up there. I
Yeah,
mean,
most people are not going to eat
just,
2 cups a day.
just your pocketbook alone, that's a little bit rough. Like you're like, I'm going to start to turn blue. But dose response, I think the more important thing that I like for people to understand when we would talk at the Research Institute would be it's about consistency. And I just felt like I was a broken record saying, well, it's timing, dose, and duration. So when did you eat the food? When are you eating it? And what are you eating it with? There's a synergy between nutrients. You get better absorption of fatty acids if you have antioxidants next to them, because fatty acids really likes to oxidize. And so if you have antioxidants with your fatty acids, you're more likely to get them into your diet. And the same thing would be true for a lot of our microbiome species. So when are you eating it? What are you eating it with? The dose, the amount, and that matters a lot. Some blueberries is better than none. I think the follow up to that RCT is to be, okay, well, what is the dose response? We've seen it in, rodent studies, and we've seen it in cell studies. We have to figure that out in human studies. And then duration, but duration seems to be the strongest long-term predictor in a structural equation model of a change. I was just having a conversation with somebody the other day. It's like, oh, I'm putting collagen in my coffee in the mornings. And I'm like, well, so you're putting it with coffee. What else are you having? Well, I do it one morning a week because it's expensive. And I was like, well, that's nice, but yeah. It's
Probably
about
not enough to kind of
consistently
cross the
doing it.
threshold.
So a half a cup of blueberries every morning with, some good Greek yogurt that's a prebiotic is probably going to be highly effective, as opposed to downing 2 whole cups of blueberries right before bed. And more cost effective too.
Right. You mentioned yogurt as a prebiotic. I'm curious. I've heard there are some supplements that have extractions of some of those key ingredients in blueberries. What do you know about those and their effectiveness?
We jumped down a field of one that, like, I don't want any of my dissertation committee members to hear me talk about, because we're talking about bioavailability. There's entire 500-page textbooks about what the bioavailability of individual nutrients and all of these pathways. But we're talking about bioavailability here and what things are. I shy away from being completely against a supplement or being completely against, for or against them in many ways, because it really depends on what you've got. And it depends on the nutrient that is being supplemented. Because it comes back to that synergy of a lot of nutrients. You can take as much vitamin D as you want, but if you don't have the right nutrients with it for absorption, it just is going to come right back out in your urine, and you just made really expensive bathroom trips. But some of these supplements, like the tart cherry juices, and things like that, have shown some clinical effectiveness. What you really have to look at is exactly how it was processed. Are these freeze dried and micro encapsulated? Then they're probably still effective from an antioxidant standpoint. But if any of these blueberry anthocyanins were heated at any point, there's pretty much nothing. They're just blue dye, and there's not a whole lot going on anymore, right? But there's a lack of regulation in this supplement industry to actually know what it is that you're getting. So look at processes, and there's some really great nonprofit organizations that look at some of these supplements, especially our whole food supplements. Because I'm not against them, and I think most of the people that I worked with at the Research Institute aren't against them, but when I would have an older adult come in and give me their diet recall, and they had 72 supplements, but they were taking that with their coffee in the morning, I was going, some of these work, some of these don't. You're spending $80 a week on supplements. Let's get some whole foods in your diet, and we can get some of those same things. But we also know it's hard to have fresh blueberries. And so if we can get some of those same anthocyanins in another way, I think that's a good idea. Because we have busy lives.
Yeah.
And we don't have time to make whole meals 3 times a day.
Supplementation's okay and can be effective, but really the best option is that whole food diet.
I think so.
What does the research tell us about the use of probiotics?
That's another one that doesn't have enough regulation, I think. I mean, and that's in my opinion, I think some of them are highly effective. But what I like to point out when people start to talk to me about probiotics is we have our gut microbiome is as unique as a fingerprint. And so we already have like a state that our microbiome would like to be in. So if we're overall healthy, we're not doing anything to damage our microbiome, then we should be maintaining consistency. Our microbiomes stay about the way that they are. So unless you've got some form of dysbiosis, you have some sort of dietary disease or a lack of something, individuals with Crohn's disease, I think probiotics is a really great mechanism. If you know there's something wrong or you've just finished a round of antibiotics, I think probiotics are really going to be helpful. But because bacteria are a neighborhood of community of their own, probiotics, when there's not something you're kind of treating about the dysbiosis, might be a waste of time and money. For some individuals, it's what is it that you're looking to improve, that might be helpful. So I'm a big fan of probiotics if I know that I've done something like, oh, well, I just did a lot of traveling. I didn't eat a lot of foods that I was used to. I have some nice probiotics in my cabinet, and I will take them for 7 to 10 days when I think that something's gone off, or I had a cold, and they gave me some antibiotics. I'm taking my probiotic while I'm still taking the antibiotic. They don't counteract it, and they help maintain my gut a little bit better. And when I look at older adults, that might be institutionalized, that are at, retirement life communities, I look and go, you're not getting, they're really softening some of those foods. They're keeping those foods to be easily digestible, but that means that we're getting some of the stuff that's help your gut out of here. Why don't you try, a smaller dose of a probiotic? But showing up at GNC and getting was like, well, this one has 100D BFUs, and I'm like, yeah, well, I don't know that it's gonna help you all that much. What is it that you're trying to treat?
So if you're generally healthy and you're eating well, probiotics may not be a great option.
Yeah, if you have a very specific goal in mind, maybe. But as far as your pocketbook goes, you could spend that same amount of money to just go over to the produce section and get some fibrous vegetables and maybe help your microbiome just as much.
If someone suspects gut problems, right? Maybe they have ongoing digestive issues, they're not feeling good, or they're just curious about the health of their gut microbiome. What are the pathways to get that checked?
Yeah, there's a lot of companies out there doing it right now. Some of them I think have a little bit more credibility than others.
Mhm.
But a lot of general practitioners now are reading up on it, and your local practitioner can run some of those tests for you and do short microbiome test. They can enroll in one of the studies that we've got in microbiome, join the Cardia study, which is a national study looking at the microbiome, and submit samples. But one of the best things that they can do to look at it is to try different foods and to actually kind of pay a little bit of attention. Is like, what things seem to be helping me? You don't have to go extreme elimination diet like the Whole30 thing that was popular a few years ago, but kind of being very intentional about excluding things and putting them back in. You don't know exactly which pieces of your microbiome you might be changing, but you do know enough about your body to recognize if you're feeling any benefit, and certainly if you're feeling any worse. And a lot of that, it can be around inflammation. It's like, I feel, I'm feeling a little bit better. I'm feeling less tired. I'm feeling more tired after making that change.
Okay. Well, from our conversation today, if you had to pick one or two things that you want to make sure that
Yeah.
people come away with, what would those be?
Man, it's that there is a lot of value in taking the time to listen to, and pay attention to your body. You don't have to become a 10-hour a day yoga person to become mindfully aware of what's going on in your body. You don't, and increased exercise, improved diet, those types of things are great. But all the exercise literature says 5-minute leisurely walk. You don't have to suddenly run 5K. So the first thing I would say to people is, small changes matter. and just being more aware is a really important change.
Yeah.
And the second thing that I like people to walk away with is that you are an individual, and that things like diet and mental health are individualized things. And the researchers that are at the forefront right now are looking at individualized effects. Something may work for you that doesn't work for others, and vice versa. And that's really important to keep in mind as you go through your journey of, of maintaining and improving your health, as we all do.
So small behavioral changes consistently applied over time, and recognition of the importance of kind of cultivating an individual awareness of what works for you and what doesn't, and probably working with your healthcare practitioner, your primary
Absolutely.
care physician, to figure out what the right balance of physical activity and dietary shifts make the most sense for you.
Yeah, even if you aren't insured, you still get a full blood panel every year, as part of the Affordable Care Act, and just maintaining and keeping track of some of your main, blood levels, can make a big difference. And just kind of looking at some of the changes you might have made in diet or exercise in the last 6 months, since that last test that you had that your doctor ran for you, can tell you a whole lot about how the things you're doing are having an impact.
Well, Dr. Knipe, great conversation. I really appreciate your time today, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Thanks, Dr. Garrison. I appreciate it. Can't wait to do it again.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.